Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we aren't just reading history, we're wading through the thick, salty marshlands of the truly inexplicable, feeling the Atlantic mist on our faces and the cold dread of an empty settlement closing in around you. You're pulling your cloak tighter, your lantern casting weak, dancing shadows across the palisades of an English colony that should be bustling with the sounds of carpentry and chatter, but instead it is eerily silent. Imagine the scene. A few rough-hewn cabins, fields ready for harvest, tools neatly put away, but not a single soul. No smoke, no cry, not even the scurry of a frightened rat. It's too tidy to be a tragedy, too complete to be a simple abandonment. This, my friends, is the Roanoke colony, and it's where we begin our exploration into mysteries that seem to actively resist explanation. You're standing right where Governor John White stood in 1590, returning from a much-needed supply trip to England, only to find the entire population of over 100 men, women and children simply gone. It's the original cold case, and you probably won't survive this evening's journey with your perfectly rational worldview intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what's the time on your local clock? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're taking a slow, shaky step toward the main post of the stockade. Your boot heel crunches on dry earth where grass refuses to grow. John White, the colony's governor and your grandfather in this scene, had left his community, including his own daughter and granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, 3 years prior. He hadn't meant to be gone so long. His quick trip for supplies became a political nightmare, entangled by the Spanish Armada's threat to England, making passage across the Atlantic almost impossible. You can feel the heavy weight of that unnecessary 3-year delay pressing down on your chest. As you walk the perimeter, you notice the only clue, the one thing left behind that wasn't a tool or furniture, the single, cryptic word Croatoan carved deeply into a fence post, and the letters CRO scratched onto a nearby tree. This is the moment where the mystery truly congeals. White had instructed the colonists that if they were forced to move, they should carve the name of their new destination, and importantly, if they were in distress, they were to carve a Maltese cross above it. You scan the post, then the tree, back and forth, holding your lantern higher. No cross, just the word. To understand the depth of this early colonial puzzle, you need to remember the brutal reality of 16th century Atlantic crossings and settlements. This wasn't a casual vacation. In the grand scheme of mainstream historical facts, the Roanoke venture was part of a larger aggressive push by Sir Walter Raleigh to establish an English foothold in North America, a move aimed squarely at challenging Spanish dominance. Raleigh's initial exploratory missions had been friendly with local tribes, particularly the people of the island, and the first attempt at a military-style garrison had failed miserably a few years earlier. This second attempt, the so-called Lost Colony of 1587, was meant to be a permanent agricultural and civil settlement. Their instructions were clear: sail north, settle on the Chesapeake Bay. But a manipulative pilot, Captain Simon Fernandez, who was more interested in privateering, dumped the settlers unceremoniously back on Roanoke Island near the end of the sailing season, forcing them to reuse the failed fort and leaving them desperately short on supplies. You can almost hear the settlers' despair at being marooned by a rogue captain. So, when White returns, you're looking at a meticulously executed vanishing act. The entire colony packed up and left, under no apparent duress, leaving behind a single confusing message. The obvious interpretation, the one White clung to, was that they had relocated to Croatoan Island, home to a friendly Native American tribe, led by the chief Manteo, who had been baptized an Anglican and was an ally of the English. Croatoan Island is now known as Hatteras Island, just 50 miles south of Roanoke. You can feel a small wave of relief wash over you at this rational possibility, but it quickly dissipates. Why didn't White immediately sail to Croatoan? Bad weather, low stores, and restless sailors prevented a quick follow-up search, forcing the governor to retreat to England once more. That was the last definitive moment of contact. The deeper you delve, the more unsettling the theories become. This is where the quirky or fringe tidbit enters the narrative, involving later exploratory missions and local lore. For centuries, the predominant local legend among the coastal Native American communities, particularly the Lumbee people of North Carolina, has been that the Roanoke settlers eventually intermarried and assimilated into the tribes. This isn't just a convenient story. Some later European explorers, notably John Lawson in the early 1700s, reported encountering Native Americans in the area who had grey eyes and spoke a form of corrupted English, sometimes even claiming to be descendants of the Roanoke people. You pause, thinking about the genetic and linguistic echo of a lost European colony, surviving for generations within a native community. Could this be the quiet, peaceful answer to the dramatic disappearance? That they didn't vanish, they simply merged? That's a gentle thought, a nice blanket to pull over this mystery, but it lacks the satisfying proof we crave. And why did they leave everything behind? Historians still argue whether the move was a voluntary planned integration with the Croatoan tribe or a desperate forced flight from starvation or attack. The lack of the Maltese cross suggests the former, a move not made under duress, yet the sheer speed and completeness of the packing up, leaving no signs of struggle, not even an errant shoe or broken utensil, is highly suspicious. Perhaps they were attacked by a rival tribe, one less friendly than Manteo's. You pull out a rusty nail from the fence post. You can feel the weight of 4 centuries in your hand. The Secatan tribe, who were more hostile to the English, lived inland. Did they ambush the settlers as they were moving, or perhaps only after they had packed everything and were waiting for a boat? If so, where are the bodies, the weapons, the blood? The archaeological digs on Roanoke Island itself have been frustratingly inconclusive, yielding little more than what White had already noted, an abandoned settlement. The search for the lost colonists became an obsession for future generations, especially as Jamestown, the next major English attempt, finally took root further north in 1607. The Jamestown colonists were specifically tasked with finding any survivors. You can imagine the chilling stories whispered around the Jamestown fires, tales of the ghostly, empty fort to the south. Captain John Smith, of Pocahontas fame, received reports from the powerful Powhatan chief Wahunsenacau, often called Chief Powhatan, claiming that he had ordered the slaughter of the Roanoke survivors who had been living near the Chesapeake Bay. This alleged massacre, however, was likely a lie, a means for Powhatan to eliminate rival groups and also perhaps intimidate the new English arrivals. Furthermore, archaeological efforts years later have found tantalising, but unconfirmed, evidence of a later European presence far inland near Edenton, North Carolina, hundreds of miles from Roanoke. These sites have yielded 16th century English ceramics and tools, known as the Dare stones, though their authenticity is heavily disputed, and the so-called Site X discoveries, suggesting a possible internal migration or splintering of the colony. The ultimate question you're left with as you stand by the silent stockade is one of narrative. Was the carving of Croatoan a statement of intent that was never fulfilled, or a statement of fact that was never followed up on? Did they sail away in a boat they built? Did they walk inland to join a different group? Or did some strange environmental catastrophe, a forgotten plague, or an undocumented weather event wipe them out so completely that the few survivors simply slipped into the forest to die quietly? The truth is likely less dramatic than alien abduction or mythical sea monsters, but it's precisely this grounded historical gap, 100 or so people walking off the map of history, that makes it so profoundly unnerving. You rub the word Croatoan with your finger, picking up the dust of 400 years. The sea wind blows through the vacant palisades, sounding like a sigh. The absence of struggle, the polite note, the total, complete lack of wreckage or human remains. It turns the Roanoke mystery from a tragedy into a terrifying blank page. It's as if the world simply erased a perfectly functional community and left only the heading for the next chapter. And with that gentle, unresolved shiver, you turn your back on the empty fort. The Atlantic waves a constant, mocking reminder of the unforgiving distance between the old world and this lost colony. You step away from the salty air and the empty silence of Roanoke, and the atmosphere shifts dramatically. Now you feel the crushing, humid heat of the Central American jungle pressing in, a heat so thick it feels like a heavy, wet blanket draped over your head. You're no longer by the sea, you're deep inland, where colossal, moss-covered pyramids jut out of the canopy like stone teeth. The only sounds are the screech of howler monkeys and the ceaseless, slow drip of water eroding perfectly carved limestone. You're walking through the ruins of Tikal or Chichen Itza, or perhaps the lesser-known, equally magnificent Calakmul. marvelling at cities that, at their zenith, rivaled the scale and complexity of any metropolis in Europe, then were abruptly swallowed by the very jungle that bore them. This is the enduring, breathtaking puzzle of the lost Mayan civilization. You trudge through what was once a Grand Sac Bay, or White Road, imagining it alive with thousands of people, priests, astronomers, farmers and artisans, yet now it's just a broken ribbon of rock choked by roots and vines. The Maya didn't disappear in a single, inexplicable flash like the colonists of Roanoke, but their sophisticated classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, ended with a swiftness that is deeply unsettling. Over the course of a century or two, particularly in the southern lowlands, the great cities, the centres of learning, governance and monumental construction, were abandoned. Construction ceased. The long count calendar, that astonishingly complex system of tracking time, stopped being inscribed on stelae. The elite, the rulers who had presided over a flowering of art and mathematics, simply vanished from the historical record, leaving the peasant populations to scatter into smaller, less centralised communities. To grasp the magnitude of this cultural collapse, you must look at what the Maya achieved. It's a key mainstream historical fact that the Maya developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a fully functional logosyllabic script. They also independently developed the concept of zero in their mathematics, hundreds of years before its common use in Europe. You run your hand over a stela, a massive carved stone monument, its glyphs telling a story of a long-dead king and a specific date deep in the past, a story that suddenly, definitively ceased. Imagine a society capable of calculating the precise cycles of Venus, mapping solar eclipses, and building pyramids taller than any structure in Europe at the time, yet they couldn't figure out how to keep the lights on, metaphorically speaking. The air thickens, and you find yourself standing before a stepped pyramid, its sheer scale a testament to astronomical precision and massive organised labour. The mystery isn't that the people vanished, because the Maya people still very much exist today, particularly in the highlands of Guatemala and Yucatan, but that their civilization, their highly stratified, magnificent urban culture, completely failed in a relatively short time frame. Why did they walk away from their incredible cities? This question has birthed a sprawling, inconclusive debate among scholars, and as you climb the slick, worn steps of the pyramid, you hear the echoes of these competing theories. The most widely accepted, though still debated ideas centre on environmental catastrophe and social pressure. You wipe the sweat from your brow, feeling the immense physical impact the tropical environment must have had. One major hypothesis, strongly supported by paleoclimatic evidence, is prolonged drought. Studies of lake sediments and speleothems, cave formations, reveal evidence of severe multi-year droughts coinciding precisely with the period of major city abandonment, a period often called the Terminal Classic period, 800 to 1000 CE. Imagine the city of Tikal relying on engineered reservoirs for water. The drought hits, the water level drops, and the social contract, the king's promise to the people that he can mediate with the rain gods, is catastrophically broken. But the drought alone isn't enough to satisfy the mystery. The Maya were resourceful. Why didn't they migrate en masse to the wetter northern regions earlier? This is where the historians still argue whether the primary driver was environmental collapse or socio-political failure. Many now embrace a multi-causal perfect storm scenario where ecological stress was amplified by relentless intercity warfare and unsustainable population growth. You look at the vast surrounding jungle and picture millions of people relying on slash-and-burn agriculture, milpa farming, which is sustainable at low population densities but catastrophic when demand for land and timber, needed to burn limestone for all that stunning white plaster, explodes. Deforestation, soil erosion, and subsequent malnutrition would have been rampant, creating a perfect petri dish for civil unrest and disease. This brings us to a compelling quirky or fringe tidbit, the systemic failure hypothesis, which suggests the collapse was less about a single catastrophe and more about the rigidity of their elite structure. The Maya rulers were obsessed with their divine right and monumental displays of power, building bigger temples, fighting bigger wars, and demanding more tribute. They were locked into an architectural and ritualistic arms race. Some scholars propose that the common people, tired of the relentless labour and the king's failure to produce rain, simply revolted, not against the system, but by walking away from it. The elites couldn't rule an empty city, and the very concept of the king's divine power eroded as the drought persisted. Imagine the silent, non-violent protest of millions of farmers simply deciding that life in the jungle with a smaller community was better than life under the oppressive, rain-failed rule of a divine king. The civilization didn't collapse. It fractured and decentralized as the core populace gave up on the idea of the grand city-state. You trace the outline of a beautiful, intricate carving on the side of a temple, a noble in an elaborate headdress. You wonder about the state of mind of the last person to look at this carving before the jungle began its slow reclamation. Were they fleeing an attack? Were they carrying their children and what little corn they had left, desperate for a new start? Or were they just the last resident watching the roof fall in on the main plaza? Interestingly, while the southern cities crumbled, some northern cities like Chichen Itza on the Yucatan Peninsula actually thrived for a time, adopting new architectural styles and perhaps benefiting from trade routes that had shifted. This regional variation is a major complicating factor. If it was just a drought, why did the south suffer so much more intensely than the north, which eventually also declined? The answer seems to be that the northern Maya, while still sophisticated, were structurally different, less reliant on the large, complex and potentially brittle water systems of the southern lowlands. The ultimate takeaway from the Mayan collapse is a sobering one. You're looking at a powerful historical lesson about the fragility of human civilization when it outstrips its resource base. It's a mystery that feels less like a riddle and more like a warning shot fired across the bow of modern civilization. The Maya did not fall victim to aliens, though I suppose the idea of an angry sky god is a close second, or some external sudden force. They appear to have been felled by a deadly combination of hubris, climate change, and the tyranny of their own rigid social structure. They wrote beautiful histories on stone, created calendars that tracked millennia, but perhaps they forgot to write a sustainable blueprint for their present. You realise that the jungle is not just covering the ruins, it's the quiet, green victor in a 1,500-year-old environmental war. You turn to leave, brushing a thick vine off your shoulder, leaving the silent monuments to their long, slow surrender to the earth. The air here feels heavy with lost knowledge, the secrets of their final days buried deeper than any king's tomb. The heavy, humid stillness of the Mayan jungle now dissipates entirely, replaced by the sterile, pressurized air of a Boeing 727 cruising somewhere between Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, on the afternoon of November 24th, 1971. You're strapped into a passenger seat, feeling the subtle vibration of the jet engines, completely unaware that you're about to witness the only unsolved case of air piracy in US history. A heist executed by a man known only by the alias D.B. Cooper. This is a mystery wrapped in a cash strap, a legend that began on a grey Thanksgiving Eve. You glance across the aisle at the man in seat 18C. He's impeccably dressed, or at least professionally bland, in a dark suit, a neat black tie, and a crisp white shirt. He's carrying a briefcase and orders a bourbon and soda from the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. He appears to be just another commuting businessman, maybe even a bank employee. His demeanour is calm, polite, almost forgettable. He's middle-aged, maybe early 40s, with dark sunglasses that hide his eyes, and he introduces himself as Dan Cooper. As the plane levels off, this seemingly ordinary man hands Florence a note. She, assuming it's just a lonely businessman giving her his phone number, slips it into her pocket without looking. But Dan Cooper leans over and whispers, with a chilling lack of drama, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." You watch Florence's face go pale as she reads the message. The key mainstream historical fact you need to understand here is the chilling simplicity of his demands. $200,000 in negotiable American currency, specifically $20 bills, packed into a backpack, 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, and a fuel truck ready in Seattle to refuel the plane. Cooper was meticulous. He specified the money must be unmarked, non-sequential, and older bills. He wasn't some panicked amateur, he was clearly calculating. Florence, recovering her professional composure, reports the threat to the cockpit. The pilot contacts air traffic control, and a full-scale FBI operation immediately spins up on the ground. You sit there, heart hammering, realizing that the fate of everyone on board rests entirely in the hands of the calm man in 18C. He is completely unflappable, consuming another drink and reportedly paying for it. He even offers the flight attendants tips on where to eat in Mexico, demonstrating an unnerving level of control and sociability. The plane circles for hours over Puget Sound, while the FBI scrambles to meet the demands. You can feel the tension as the aircraft finally touches down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, SeaTac. Cooper refuses to allow the other passengers to disembark until the money and parachutes are delivered directly to the plane. Once the items are on board, Cooper allows the other 36 passengers and 2 flight attendants to leave. Now only Cooper, the cockpit crew, and one remaining flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, are left on the plane. You watch him carefully examine the parachutes and the money, ensuring every detail is correct. He then reveals his plan for the second phase of the flight. His instructions are precise and technically astute. Fly to Mexico City, but at an altitude no higher than 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down, the flaps at 15 degrees, and the cabin unpressurized, flying at a low airspeed of just 100 knots. These settings were necessary for a successful parachute jump from the rear of a 727, a detail that suggests a disturbing degree of knowledge about aviation and jumping. As the plane takes off, heading south, the FBI and military jets are scrambling to track it, but Cooper has another trick up his sleeve. He orders Tina to show him how to open the air stairs, the retractable staircase at the rear of the Boeing 727, which was a unique feature of that model. This detail is a key, quirky or fringe tidbit in the case, suggesting that Cooper specifically chose the 727 because of its rear exit feature. He ties the rope from one of the reserve parachutes to the handle of the air stairs to prevent them from closing once he's gone. At approximately 8:13 p.m., somewhere over the dense forested terrain of southwestern Washington south of Seattle, a warning light flashes in the cockpit, indicating the air stairs have been lowered. The pilots, confined to the cockpit by Cooper's orders, feel a distinct shift in air pressure. They know with cold certainty that Dan Cooper is gone. He parachuted out into a cold, dark, rainy night with his ransom. He vanished into the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The search that followed was one of the largest and most intense manhunts in American history. You imagine search parties trudging through miles of rugged, unforgiving territory, thick forests, hidden lakes, and steep ravines, all shrouded in the damp cold of a late November night. They found nothing. No parachute, no suit, no Cooper. Historians still argue whether D.B. Cooper was an experienced paratrooper, an amateur thrill-seeker with a death wish, or perhaps a military veteran with highly specialised knowledge. The facts are contradictory. An experienced jumper would likely never jump into such terrain and weather, in the dark, with only a reserve parachute strapped to his chest and a bag of cash. Yet, his detailed technical knowledge of the 727 and the parachutes suggests a familiarity that goes beyond casual reading. Perhaps he was a former service member who was desperate, banking on the element of surprise, and the fact that an airborne jump from a commercial jet was unprecedented. For nearly a decade, the mystery was a perfect, pristine enigma, a man who simply evaporated into the sky. Then, in 1980, a 9-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging on a sandbar along the Columbia River, a full 18 miles from the drop zone. He discovered 3 packets of the ransom money, severely deteriorated, but still identifiable by their serial numbers. This is an indisputable piece of evidence. The money's discovery confirmed that Cooper had indeed jumped, and that the jump had not gone according to any easy plan. The discovery of the cash muddies the waters of the original case. Was the money washed downriver from the drop zone? Did Cooper survive the jump and simply lose part of the bag while fleeing? Or, and this is the chilling, most likely scenario, did he die on impact, with the money scattering and eventually being washed down by spring runoff? The lack of any other remains, no clothing, no bones, no parachute silk, is deeply baffling, especially considering the intense focus on the area by the FBI over decades. The FBI followed hundreds of leads over the years. They investigated dozens of credible suspects, including one man, Richard McCoy Jr., who carried out a similar, though less successful, air piracy months later. McCoy fit the profile, but the FBI ultimately cleared him of the Cooper case, citing differences in MO. Another compelling suspect was Kenneth Christensen, a former airline employee with military paratrooper experience who had bought property near the potential drop zone after the heist, a theory popularised by journalist Jeffrey Gray. The fact is, despite the intense scrutiny, the original Dan Cooper, whose name itself was a mistake made by the press and never corrected, The ticket was purchased under the name Dan Cooper, which was then misreported as DB. Has never been identified. You look out the window of the imaginary jet into the black rain-swept sky. You realise that Cooper's success was not in escaping the law, but in escaping identity. He became a legend because he successfully walked away from the modern world. He is a ghost story told with serial numbers and flight plans. The case officially went dormant in 2016, but the romantic 70s-era image of a daring man jumping into the night with a bag of cash remains an irresistible cultural myth. Whether he survived or not is immaterial to the mystery. His ultimate final disappearance is the real triumph, a baffling, cold, silent echo in the history of crime. You're trading the cold, anonymous sky over Washington for the brutal subarctic cold of the northern Ural Mountains in Russia. The year is 1959, and the date is the night of February 2nd. The air is so sharp it hurts to breathe, and the snow under your boots crunches with a dry metallic sound. You are climbing the slopes of Kholat-Shakhl, translated from the Mansi language as Dead Mountain, following the doomed tracks of 9 young, experienced Soviet hikers. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, and it is arguably one of the most disturbing, contradictory and stubbornly inexplicable tragedies in modern history. The group, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and all skilled ski tourers. Their objective was a challenging 350-kilometre winter expedition to Mount Autorten. You imagine their camaraderie, their youthful ambition, and the sense of adventure that motivated them to tackle this unforgiving wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, fell ill early on and turned back, a twist of fate that saved his life and left him the sole survivor of the initial group of 10. The remaining 9 pressed on, setting up their last camp on the evening of February 1st, high on the mountain slope. Now, you are standing beside their tent site on February 26th, following the search party that finally located the group's camp. What you see is immediately wrong. The tent is half collapsed, buried in snow, and most crucially it has been slashed open from the inside. Not torn by an external force, but deliberately sliced open, as if the occupants were desperate to escape immediately, without bothering with the zipper. You follow the trails of footprints, 9 sets, leading away from the tent. The footprints are highly unusual, some are bare or in socks, others in a single boot. They trail off 1.5 kilometres down the slope, away from the protective cover of the tree line and toward a dense pine forest. This is a key piece of mainstream historical fact and the central enigma. Why would 9 experienced mountaineers in sub-zero temperatures, estimated at minus 25 to minus 30 degrees Celsius, cut their way out of their only shelter and walk into the frigid night, inadequately clothed, towards certain exposure? The first 2 bodies were found by a cedar tree at the forest edge, near the spot where the footprints vanished. These hikers, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, were dressed only in their underwear and socks. Their hands were scraped and bruised, and branches on the cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting they had desperately climbed to collect firewood. Near the bodies, investigators found remnants of a small fire. These 2 seem to have succumbed to hypothermia first. The next 3 bodies, Dyatlov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin, were found scattered along the slope, frozen in poses suggesting they were trying to return to the tent. Dyatlov was found clutching a handful of pine needles, a detail that adds a strange layer of desperation to the scene. Slobodin's body had a fracture on his skull, which coroners initially dismissed as a natural effect of a fall, but which has since become a point of contention. It took another 2 months to find the remaining 4 bodies, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine deeper in the forest. It is the discovery of these 4, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Semyon Zolotarev, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, that elevates the Dyatlov Pass incident from a tragic hiking accident to a true unsolved mystery. These hikers were far better dressed than the first group, suggesting they took clothes from their deceased companions, a grim act of survival. But their injuries defied any natural explanation. Thibault-Brignol had a major skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotarev had incredibly severe internal injuries, broken ribs, massive chest trauma, and in Dubinina's case the horrifying absence of her tongue, eyes, and part of her lip and facial tissue. The force required to inflict these chest and head injuries was compared by the Soviet doctor who performed the autopsies to that of a major car crash. Yet, there were no external bruises or soft tissue damage consistent with such a massive blow. you feel a profound chill that goes beyond the outside temperature. This is where the officially declared cause of death, a compelling natural force, falls entirely short. The nature of the trauma is a key quirky or fringe tidbit. Later, the clothing of some of the victims, notably Dubinina and Kolevatov, was found to have levels of radioactivity higher than normal, though the source and significance of this radiation remain highly disputed. Was it contamination from their workplace, or something else entirely? The radiation findings were a minor part of the original closed investigation, but they've fueled decades of theories involving secret military testing, or even a bizarre localized energy source. Historians still argue whether the deaths were caused by an avalanche, a sudden infrasound wave, or some form of aggressive non-human encounter. The avalanche theory is popular but problematic. The slope was not steep enough for a typical slab avalanche, and crucial evidence, the undisturbed tent site and the long trail of footprints leading away, contradicts the idea of a massive sudden snow burial. Furthermore, the nature of the internal injuries on the final 4 victims is inconsistent with being crushed by snow. Broken bones from an avalanche usually show crushing damage and external bruising. Theories stretch from the plausible to the truly outlandish. One theory involves infrasound, suggesting that the wind passing over the top of the mountain created a powerful, low-frequency acoustic wave that induced feelings of intense panic, nausea, and irrational fear in the hikers, driving them to cut the tent and flee. Another, more grounded theory centres on a localised slab avalanche that might have only partially collapsed the tent, scaring the hikers out, followed by the deep internal injuries of the last 4 being the result of them falling into the deep hidden ravine where they were found. This still doesn't fully explain the missing tongue or the strange lack of external bruising. You consider the theory of a Mansi attack. The Mansi are the indigenous people of the area known to be protective of their traditional hunting grounds. However, the Mansi were immediately cleared by investigators. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks other than the hiker's own, and the nature of the injuries was not consistent with the primitive weapons the Mansi used. The most enduring, and perhaps most unnerving layer of the mystery involves the heavy hand of the Soviet government. The investigation was closed quickly, the files were highly classified, and the bodies were released to families with the strange instruction that they were to be buried in sealed coffins. The final official ruling, a compelling natural force, was a classic piece of Soviet bureaucratic obfuscation. This secrecy, combined with reports from other hikers in the area that night of strange orange spheres of light seen in the northern sky, has led to decades of speculation about secret missile tests. A controlled explosion gone wrong, or the testing of advanced weaponry. You shiver not from the cold, but from the realization that the official conclusion of natural force simply cannot account for the forensic evidence, the internally cut tent, the contradictory clothing choices, the missing body parts, and the massive, unbruised internal trauma. Dyatlov Pass remains a chilling monument to a night of unexplained terror, where 9 people fled their sanctuary for a terrifying invisible threat and died with secrets etched into their bones. You leave the silent, snow-covered slope, stepping carefully over the spot where the last 4 were found, carrying the haunting image of those eyes, and that tongue, and the crushing force that somehow left no mark on the skin. You're now shaking off the deep internal chill of the Ural Mountains and trading it for the bracing, salt-laced wind of the open Atlantic. The year is 1872, and the vessel beneath your feet is the Canadian brigantine Dei Gratia. You're sailing eastward, about 400 miles east of the Azores, when the lookout cries out, "Sail on the starboard bow!" Your captain, David Morehouse, squints through his glass at the erratic, hesitant movements of the distant ship. As you draw closer on December 5th, you realise something is deeply, profoundly wrong. The ship is listing slightly, her sails are partially set and in poor condition, and she's sailing erratically, her rudder swinging loose. This ship is the Mary Celeste, and she's about to become the quintessential ghost ship, a mystery that haunts the high seas to this day. As the Dei Gratia pulls alongside, you and a small boarding party climb aboard. The silence is the first thing that hits you, a dead, unnerving silence that swallows the sound of the wind and waves. There is no one on deck, no watch, no cry of alarm or response to your hails. The ship is completely deserted. This is the central, unshakable mainstream historical fact. The Mary Celeste was found sailing under partial power, fully seaworthy, and without a single member of her crew of 7, plus her captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. 10 people had simply vanished into thin air. You walk the decks, your footsteps echoing too loudly on the timber. The Mary Celeste was a 100-foot vessel that had set sail from Staten Island, New York a month earlier, bound for Genoa, Italy, with a cargo of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. As you descend into the cabin, you begin to catalogue the contradictory evidence that makes this case so baffling. The ship was not wrecked or visibly damaged. The chronometer, a vital navigation tool, was missing, as were the sextant and the ship's 2 main lifeboats. However, the 9-foot-long yawl boat, which was far less seaworthy, was still secured on deck. More bizarrely, everything else essential for a long voyage was in place. The captain's bed was unmade. A half-eaten meal, perhaps breakfast, or perhaps the last meal the crew ever had, was set out in the galley. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine sat untouched. A child's small impression was found on the bed. In the logbook, the last entry was dated November 25th, 10 days earlier, placing the ship near the Azores. A final, calm notation on a perfectly ordinary journey. You descend into the crew's quarters. Their personal possessions were still there: pipes, boots, clothing, and small trinkets. In the captain's cabin, valuable papers and money were undisturbed. You find no signs of a struggle, no blood, no violence, nothing to suggest a frantic attack or sudden mutiny. The pumps were working fine, and the hold, though containing about 3.5 feet of water, was not alarmingly full. It was easily manageable. You peer down into the cargo hold at the barrels of alcohol. 7 of the barrels are empty, but the remaining 1,694 are intact. This total pristine absence of violence or obvious disaster leads to the dizzying array of theories. The most crucial finding that dictates almost all analysis is that the chronometer and sextant, which are the tools needed for navigation, and the 2 lifeboats were gone. This suggests that the crew abandoned the Mary Celeste voluntarily and in a hurry, taking the essential navigational instruments with them, assuming they would eventually make it to safety. But why would a captain abandon a perfectly good ship, one that was the source of their salvation, for 2 small lifeboats in the middle of the Atlantic? Historians still argue whether the Mary Celeste was abandoned due to a sudden, frightening but non-fatal emergency, or due to a combination of more subtle, environmental factors. One compelling theory centres on the cargo of crude alcohol. You rub your gloved hand on the lid of one of the remaining barrels. The empty barrels might hold a key clue. The alcohol was denatured, not meant for consumption, and could emit explosive fumes. The quirky or fringe tidbit associated with this is the theory of a vapour explosion. The captain, upon checking the hold, may have noticed the missing alcohol and detected the presence of toxic explosive vapours. In a panic, fearing the entire ship was about to detonate, he might have ordered everyone into the lifeboats, perhaps tethering the boats to the ship to wait out the emergency. You imagine the scene. Captain Briggs, fearing for his family and crew, quickly bundles them into the lifeboats, attaching a rope to the stern of the Mary Celeste. Then, a sudden storm, a rogue wave, or a quick change in the wind separates the lifeboat from the brigantine. The lifeboat, smaller and less stable, would have quickly been swamped or capsized in the rough Atlantic, leaving the Mary Celeste to sail on, an unpiloted monument to a fleeting panic. The fact that the ship's rigging and sails were somewhat disarrayed supports the idea that the crew had been rapidly adjusting the sails just before the abandonment, perhaps in response to a sudden squall. Other theories are far more dramatic. Was it a mutiny? The lack of blood rules out a violent fight among the crew, and the presence of the captain's family and their undisturbed valuables makes a traditional mutiny for plunder highly unlikely. Was it piracy? Again, the untouched valuables and cargo discount this. Did a sea monster snatch the crew? You hear the light splash of the water against the hull, and dismiss the romanticism of the deep. The forensic evidence of a deserted, seaworthy ship points away from anything mythological. Another, slightly more plausible theory involves a waterspout. A powerful waterspout, essentially a tornado over water, could have hit the ship, sucking the crew off the deck. However, this wouldn't explain why the lifeboats were missing. Perhaps the most tragic theory focuses on the pump malfunction. While the ship was found with only a manageable amount of water in the hold, Briggs might have initially feared the worst. If the pumps were temporarily blocked or malfunctioning, the water level could have risen quickly, leading to a panicked, mistaken decision to abandon the ship before the problem was resolved. Again, The missing lifeboats suggest a belief that they could still navigate to safety once away from the perceived danger. The story of the Mary Celeste is a powerful reminder that sometimes the simplest explanation involves the most tragic misjudgment. It's an unnerving thought, that the entire mystery boils down to a captain making a rational, albeit ultimately fatal decision based on incomplete information. You are left alone on the deck, the brigantine swaying gently in the light swells, a fully operational ship that swallowed 10 lives and offered nothing but perfect haunting silence in return. You're now leaving the tempestuous sea behind and entering the quiet, dust-filled vault of a rare book library, probably somewhere in Europe, perhaps even the secluded Bennecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. The date you feel is less important than the antiquity of the object you are about to examine, the Voynich manuscript. This is not a story of a disappearance, but of an infuriating, persistent presence. A 240-page illustrated codex bound in vellum, written in a language that no one, across hundreds of years and using every known cryptographic technique, has ever been able to read. You gently open the manuscript. The pages rustle with the weight of 5 centuries. The script is the first thing to grab you. It flows across the pages in small, elegant, rounded characters, forming words that look nothing like Latin, Greek, or any known alphabet. It's written left to right, with some breaks for paragraphs, and it displays a consistent structure, suggesting it's a genuine language or cipher, not just random scribbling. This is the mainstream historical fact that keeps cryptographers up at night. The text has the statistical properties of a natural language, a frequency distribution of letters and word lengths that is too organised to be nonsense. Yet it defies all known attempts at translation. As you flip through the pages, you notice the drawings, hundreds of them, painted in muted greens, browns and blues. The illustrations are bizarre and organised into distinct sections, which gives us the only real clue as to the manuscript's content, if not its meaning. You come across the herbal section, which makes up roughly half the book. You examine drawings of plants, but they are unlike any flora known to modern botany. Some look like familiar herbs, but with strange added appendages. Others are purely fantastical. Next, the astronomical section, featuring diagrams of stars, suns and moons, interspersed with peculiar cosmological charts. You pause at a folio showing 12 different medallions, each containing small drawings of stars and sometimes what appear to be tiny human figures bathing in pools. The balneological or biological section is the weirdest. It's filled with drawings of small, nude female figures with disproportionately swollen bellies, bathing in elaborate green and brown pools or connected by strange tubes and organs that defy anatomy. You might chuckle lightly. Is this some kind of medieval health spa catalogue? Or a proto-diagram of the human reproductive system, filtered through a Renaissance fever dream? You sense the deep bewilderment of the scholars who study this book. Finally, there's the pharmaceutical section, depicting small vessels, bottles, and perhaps compounding formulas, and the recipes section, dense with text and marked by star-like flowers, which is the most highly structured section and the part that many linguists believe is most likely a true cipher. The man who introduced this mystery to the modern world was Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who acquired it in 1912 from a Jesuit college near Rome. Voynich subsequently spent the remainder of his life trying to decode it. The history of the manuscript is a quirky or fringe tidbit in itself, involving a bizarre chain of ownership that can be traced back to the 17th century. It's believed to have once belonged to Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who was obsessed with alchemy and esoterica, and who reportedly paid 600 gold ducats for it, believing it was the work of the English philosopher Roger Bacon. The manuscript was later passed to various scholars and alchemists, each one failing to unlock its secrets. Its association with Bacon and other famous, eccentric figures of the past only deepened its mythical status. So, what is the text? There are 3 main possibilities, and historians still argue whether the Voynich manuscript is a coded message in a known European language, a genuine, albeit extinct or invented language, or an elaborate 15th or 16th century hoax. Let's start with the cipher theory. This is the most romantic idea, that the manuscript is a highly complex encoded message. Yet, cryptographers from both world wars, including the legendary codebreakers who cracked the Nazi Enigma machine, have failed to make a dent. Standard cipher types like substitution or polyalphabetic ciphers are easily ruled out by computational analysis. If it is a cipher, it must be something entirely unique, perhaps a transposition cipher based on a book that has been lost, or a steganographic method where the true meaning is hidden by the visual organisation of the words rather than by the letters themselves. Next, consider the genuine language theory. Some analysts have proposed that the manuscript is written in an artificial language constructed for secrecy or philosophical purposes, a concept not uncommon during the Renaissance. Others, focusing on the visual characteristics, suggest it might be a language that existed briefly in the Balkans or the Caucasus, or perhaps a dialect of a known language written phonetically using an invented alphabet. However, the absence of any historical record for such a script makes this a reach. The fact that many words are repeated, often 3 or more times in a row, is unusual for any known language, suggesting either a very specific kind of text, perhaps an index or a list of names, or a strange method of encrypting. Finally, the most cynical theory, the hoax. Could this be a beautiful, complex forgery designed to fleece Emperor Rudolph II? The 15th century dating of the vellum by carbon dating suggests that someone wrote it long before Voynich found it, ruling out a modern hoax. However, it could still be a sophisticated 15th century forgery. A genius prankster could have created an elaborate script and illustrated it beautifully, simply to create a piece of desirable occult merchandise. If it is gibberish, then the consistent linguistic structure would be an unparalleled feat of artistic forgery, making the hoax almost as fascinating as a decipherable text. The difficulty is that a hoax of this magnitude requires enormous effort with little discernible historical payoff for the supposed prankster. You close the book, the smooth vellum cool beneath your fingers. The Voynich manuscript doesn't threaten you with a lost life or a dark conspiracy, it threatens your intellectual confidence. It is an artifact of pure resistance, a beautiful, stubborn refusal to yield its secrets. It represents a piece of knowledge, whether pharmacological, astronomical, or ritualistic, that was so important to its creator that it was shrouded in a near-perfect barrier. You're left holding a visual encyclopedia of the unknown, an exquisitely illustrated silence that continues to confound and tempt the greatest minds of the 21st century, forever asking, what did they know that we can't understand? You leave the silence of the library and the frustrating script of the Voynich manuscript for the windswept plains of Wiltshire, England. The air is cool and smells of ancient chalk dust and wet grass. You're standing in the shadow of Stonehenge, the colossal, iconic, Neolithic and Bronze Age monument that has been baffling visitors and archaeologists for centuries. This is a mystery not of absence, but of imposing, unmoving presence, a circle of massive stones that demands to know, why? You walk the perimeter of the outer ditch, which along with the bank defined the earliest stage of the monument. You realise the construction of Stonehenge wasn't a single event, it was a process, an effort spanning roughly 1,500 years, from 3000 BCE to 1500 BCE. This extended time frame is a key mainstream historical fact that confounds simple explanations. The site began as a massive circular earthwork and a cemetery, with the burial of cremated remains in the Aubrey holes, 56 chalk pits dug around the inner circumference. It was only later, around 2500 BCE, that the massive stones arrived. You approach the iconic central ring. The most immediate puzzle is the sheer logistics of moving the stones. You place your hand on a rough grey sarsen stone, one of the huge uprights. These stones, averaging 25 tons each, were sourced from the Marlborough Downs, over 20 miles away. Next, you look at the smaller inner bluestones, which weigh between 2 and 5 tons. The mystery here deepens. These stones were transported a staggering 140 miles from the Priestley Hills in Wales. You stop, trying to visualise the effort. No modern crane, no high-powered truck, just Bronze Age humans relying solely on muscle, ropes, wooden rollers, and perhaps sledges. The distance and the weight involved in moving the bluestones is a phenomenal quirky or fringe tidbit. Some historians have posited that the stones were transported primarily by water, perhaps ferried on boats along the coast and up rivers, while others suggest massive teams of oxen pulling them across land. A more radical theory, and one that is hotly debated, is that the bluestones were not moved by people at all, but were already scattered across the Salisbury Plain by glacial drift thousands of years earlier. However, geological analysis of the stone origins in Wales strongly contradicts this. meaning the transport was undoubtedly a deliberate, organised human effort of staggering proportions. The question quickly shifts from how they did it to who they were and why they did it. Recent DNA analysis of remains buried near Stonehenge has offered some clarity on the builders, suggesting that the population involved in its later construction had connections to the Aegean, potentially originating from groups that arrived via the Mediterranean, replacing earlier Neolithic populations. This suggests a significant cultural shift that coincided with the most complex phases of building. As you walk among the towering trilithons, two uprights capped by a lintel, the main theory that immediately jumps out is its function as a massive prehistoric astronomical observatory or calendar. You align yourself, as tourists and druids do today, with the famous heel stone, which stands outside the main circle. On the summer solstice, the sun rises directly over this stone, perfectly aligning with the central avenue and the main axis of the monument. Similarly, the winter solstice sunset aligns with the main trilithon within the circle. This undisputed fact suggests that the purpose of Stonehenge was deeply intertwined with tracking the solar year, a critical function for an agricultural society. But was it only a calendar? Historians still argue whether Stonehenge's primary function was that of a solar temple, a massive burial ground, or a centre for healing. The burial ground theory is strong. As mentioned, the earliest phase of the monument involved the cremation burials in the Aubrey holes. Later excavations have found over 50,000 human remains buried at or near the site over a millennium, making it the largest known cemetery from the British Neolithic period. This suggests a central role in funerary rites and ancestor veneration. Imagine this space not as a quiet tourist attraction, but as a site saturated with ritual, smoke, and the presence of the dead. The healing centre theory is based on the bluestones. Geologists have confirmed that the Welsh Preseli Hills are rich in rocks that possess sonic or acoustic properties. When struck, some of these stones resonate like bells. More importantly, the Preseli region has been associated with ancient healing springs and mystical properties. The theory is that the bluestones were dragged 140 miles not for their aesthetic, but for their perceived magical or curative properties, turning Stonehenge into a prehistoric Lourdes, a pilgrimage site where the sick and infirm travelled vast distances for ritual healing. Examination of some human remains from the site shows evidence of serious illness and injury, possibly supporting this idea. Another, slightly more political theory sees Stonehenge as a monument to peace and unity. Given the massive collaborative effort required to build it, involving different groups from Wales and the different parts of the island, some archaeologists believe it may have been constructed at a time of political stability and served as a central meeting place, a neutral territory for disparate tribes to gather for religious ceremonies or trade. You look at the interlocking lintels, the smooth engineering of the mortise and tenon joints, and you see an analogy for the interlocking of various peoples. Ultimately, Stonehenge remains an architectural enigma. The why is likely a complex tapestry of all these reasons. A solar calendar for their agricultural and religious year, a sacred burial ground for their honoured dead, a centre for pilgrimage and healing, and a monumental statement of the power and organisational skill of the ancient peoples of Britain. It is a mystery that doesn't hide its evidence. It simply presents too much, leaving you to piece together the silent intentions of a civilization that left no written record. You feel the scale of the structure, the cold permanence of the stone, and the humbling realization that a profound spiritual and intellectual life thrived here, a life we can only dimly perceive through the shadow it casts on the longest day of the year. You're now transported from the ancient cold stones of Stonehenge to the desolate primeval forests of Siberia. The date is June 30th, 1908, and the time is 7:17 a.m. local. You're standing in the vast, almost uninhabited region near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River. The air is still, the silence broken only by the buzzing of mosquitoes, when suddenly the sky explodes. This is the Tunguska event, a force so immense it remains one of the greatest atmospheric mysteries of the last century. You feel a profound, visceral shockwave, a massive explosion in the upper atmosphere, estimated to be equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. If this happened today, it would be felt globally. Even thousands of miles away, seismic stations across Europe registered the blast, and the atmospheric pressure wave circled the globe twice. This is the central mainstream historical fact you must grapple with. A celestial object exploded over the remote taiga, levelling an area of approximately 2,000 square kilometres or 800 square miles of forest. You look around the area, the devastation is absolute. Over 80 million trees are flattened, lying in neat rows radiating outwards from a central point, like spokes on a massive wheel. Yet, when you arrive at the epicentre, the scene is baffling. While the trees surrounding the epicentre are snapped and levelled, the trees at the exact centre are still standing, stripped of their branches and bark looking like telephone poles stuck in the earth. Crucially, there is no impact crater. Absolutely none. This lack of a crater is the initial anomaly that ruled out a standard meteorite collision. It led Russian mineralogist Leonid Kulik to spend years leading expeditions to the remote site, starting in the 1920s, driven by the belief that he would find the nickel-iron remnants of a massive meteorite. He found only the pattern of destruction. The fact that the object exploded in the air, an airburst, is what caused the blast wave to spread spherically, levelling the trees without creating the telltale crater, or leaving behind the standard fragments associated with an impact. So, what exploded? The primary, most accepted theory is that it was a large stony asteroid or a comet fragment. If the object was a comet, it would have been composed mostly of ice and dust. Upon entering the Earth's atmosphere, the extreme speed and friction would have caused it to superheat and disintegrate completely a few kilometres above the surface. This rapid vaporization would explain the enormous blast and the complete lack of surface debris or a crater. However, the event possesses a quirky or fringe tidbit that has fueled endless speculation: the light in the night phenomenon. For several nights after the event, people across Europe and Asia reported witnessing unusually bright white cloudless nights. This extended twilight was so intense that people in London could read a newspaper outdoors at midnight without artificial light. Scientists now believe this was caused by dust and ice particles from the fragmented celestial body being lofted high into the mesosphere and reflecting sunlight, but at the time it added a layer of eerie, preternatural strangeness to the event. You consider the historians still argue whether the object was an icy comet, a denser asteroid, or something else entirely. The distinction is critical because it impacts the likelihood of future similar events. If it was a fragile, low-density comet, it supports the idea of an airburst. If it was a denser asteroid, it challenges the airburst theory unless the asteroid was particularly porous or fragmented early in its atmospheric entry. The less accepted theories veer into the fantastic, largely spurred by the initial lack of comprehensive scientific data from the highly inaccessible location. You might hear whispers of a mini black hole passing through the Earth, or perhaps the explosion of a small amount of antimatter. Both are dismissed by modern physics as highly improbable, given the lack of corresponding phenomena like exit damage for the black hole or specific gamma-ray signatures for the antimatter. A more grounded, though still alternative theory involves a geophysical event, such as a massive release of highly volatile methane gas from the Earth's crust that was ignited by lightning. This theory is largely rejected because it fails to account for the eyewitness reports of a brilliant object streaking across the sky before the explosion. One of the most recent and compelling theories, a twist on the comet idea, suggests that a fragment of a very large comet, perhaps the Encke's comet, was responsible. This fragment, made of stone and ice, was travelling at an extremely shallow angle. This shallow trajectory is key. As it hit the atmosphere, it would have generated an immense shockwave that pushed the air ahead of it, leading to a massive detonation high up before the object itself fully disintegrated. This explains why the trees in the centre were left standing. The blast wave travelled downwards and outwards, scorching the centre but not flattening it. You look closer at the trees at the centre of the blast. They are burnt from above. The heat generated by the airburst was so intense that it caused second-degree burns on the handful of nomadic Evenki people who were within a 60-kilometre radius of the blast site. The fire was followed by the crushing force of the air pressure wave, but all the energy was delivered from above, not from a ground impact. The Tunguska event is a quiet, powerful reminder of the cosmic vulnerability of our planet. It occurred over an area of the Earth where few people lived, which is why the body count was minimal. If that event had happened just 4 hours later, the Earth's rotation would have placed a major European city, possibly St. Petersburg, directly beneath the blast. The sheer power of the explosion, the lack of an object, and the massive silent destruction make it a mystery that defies simple classification. A celestial phantom that brushed our planet and left only a massive felled forest as its calling card. You are now leaving the burnt, flattened forests of Siberia and stepping onto the deck of a sleek private yacht, or maybe the cockpit of a 1940s-era Avenger torpedo bomber. The air is warm, the sea is a dazzling, deceptively calm sapphire blue, and you are somewhere in the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean. You're entering the most notorious patch of water on Earth, the Bermuda Triangle. This is a region defined less by geography and more by a terrifying reputation for swallowing ships and aircraft without a trace, often in clear weather, without so much as a final distress call. The boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle are fluid and debated, but generally the vertices are considered to be Bermuda, Puerto Rico and Miami, Florida, encompassing a busy, well-travelled shipping and flight lane. The mystery isn't just the disappearances themselves, but the baffling completeness of the vanishings. It's the silent, clean erasure of advanced technology and human life. The event that truly launched this area into global consciousness, and which is a definitive mainstream historical fact of the Triangle's lore, occurred in December 1945, the loss of Flight 19. 5 US Navy TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, on a routine training flight from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, vanished completely. The leader of the flight, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, radioed in, sounding disoriented and confused, reporting that his compasses were malfunctioning and that the sea looks funny. Communication was sporadic, marked by Taylor's increasing distress and confusion about his location. Then, silence. Adding a macabre twist to the tragedy, a massive 13-man PBY Mariner flying boat, sent out to search for Flight 19, also disappeared without a trace. All 6 aircraft and all 27 men were never found. You stand in a modern control tower, listening to the crackle of the static and the fading, panicked voices. You ask yourself the same question investigators have asked for decades. How do 5 planes in formation, all equipped with radios and then a massive search plane, simply vanish in an area that, while prone to sudden squalls, is hardly uncharted territory? The simplest, and often most accurate explanation for most disappearances in the Triangle is entirely rational. You have to remember the sheer volume of traffic. Historians still argue whether the Bermuda Triangle's reputation is due to legitimate, unusual geophysical phenomena or merely an exaggerated statistical anomaly. The region is home to violent, unpredictable Gulf Stream currents, which can swiftly sweep wreckage away. It's also an area where sudden, intense tropical storms and hurricanes are common. Furthermore, the number of disappearances, when weighed against the millions of vessels and flights that pass through the area safely every year, is arguably no higher than any other stretch of ocean. The sea is always an unforgiving environment, and human error, equipment failure, and sudden weather changes account for the vast majority of tragedies. However, the nature of some of the disappearances resists easy rationalization. This is where the quirky or fringe tidbit often appears, involving the unusual geological and magnetic properties of the region. The Atlantic seabed beneath the Triangle contains massive deposits of methane hydrate, frozen cages of methane gas trapped under intense pressure. Under certain conditions, perhaps triggered by seismic activity, these hydrates can destabilize and release enormous bubbles of methane gas. You imagine a ship sailing over a rising methane plume. As the lighter gas rises, it drastically reduces the density and buoyancy of the water above it. A ship, even a large one, would suddenly lose all its flotation and sink almost instantly, without time for the crew to even realize they were in danger, let alone radio a distress call. Similarly, a massive release of methane into the atmosphere could potentially cause the engines of aircraft passing through the plume to flame out due to the lack of oxygen, causing a catastrophic descent. This theory, though difficult to prove, offers a genuinely scientifically plausible, non-supernatural explanation for the speed and totality of some vanishings. Other theories focus on the compass issues reported by Flight 19. The Triangle is one of the few places on Earth where true north and magnetic north align, meaning traditional magnetic compasses can act erratically or point directly to true north, confusing pilots who are accustomed to compensating for the angular difference, known as magnetic variation. This slight magnetic oddity, combined with a pilot already experiencing spatial disorientation in bad weather, could lead to a fatal navigational error, sending them hundreds of miles off course and out of range of rescue. Beyond the scientific, the mystery of the Triangle has, of course, spawned a host of supernatural explanations. You hear whispers of Atlantis lying on the seabed, its mystical energy crystals playing havoc with navigation systems. Remember that lost city from the outline? Or perhaps it's the work of UFOS, using the deep ocean as a hidden base. You find yourself smiling slightly at the drama of these theories, but you recognise their allure. It's easier to blame a mythical force than to accept the terror of a rational disaster that leaves no trace. The Bermuda Triangle is, ultimately, a place where geography meets folklore and fear. It is the vast watery graveyard of hundreds of ships and planes, lost over centuries, most through entirely understandable means. But it is the handful of cases, like Flight 19 or the Collier USS Cyclops in 1918, which disappeared with 306 people and was the US Navy's single greatest non-combat loss of life, that ensure the legend persists. These total silent disappearances demand a single, unique and terrifying explanation, even if the truth is likely a grim combination of bad luck, poor navigation, sudden methane plumes, and the vast, cold capacity of the ocean to simply erase its victims. You're leaving the warm, mysterious currents of the Bermuda Triangle for the fog-laced streets and scenic highways of Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The atmosphere is tense, marked by the seismic cultural shifts of the era, and underneath it all, a deep, pervasive dread. You're now tracing the terrifying and elusive path of the Zodiac Killer, a nameless predator who didn't just murder, but actively communicated with the media and the police, turning his killing spree into a frustrating, dark spectacle. The Zodiac's reign of terror officially begins in December 1968, with the shooting of 2 teenagers in their car near Vallejo. Over the next year, he is definitively linked to at least 5 murders and 2 attempted murders across Vallejo, Benicia and San Francisco. This is the mainstream historical fact that establishes his grim notoriety. Unlike many anonymous killers, the Zodiac craved fame and control, using the media as his personal bulletin board to amplify his horror. You are standing in the newsroom of the San Francisco Chronicle in August 1969, watching the frenzy as the first set of cryptic letters arrives. The killer demands that these letters be published on the front page, threatening to go on a new killing spree if his demands are not met. The letters are sensational, boastful and disturbing, detailing the murders with chilling precision. Crucially, each letter contains one part of a cipher, a scrambled message that the killer claimed contained his identity. The first cipher, the 408 cipher, consisted of 408 symbols. You look at the coded message, a jumble of astrological symbols, Greek letters, and unusual characters. Within a week, the cipher was actually cracked, not by the police, but by a high school teacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Harden. The decoded message was a rambling, narcissistic declaration of his identity and motives, proclaiming that he was collecting slaves for the afterlife, but it did not contain his name. This act of being decoded so quickly was seemingly a blow to the killer's ego, prompting him to return with something far more difficult. This brings us to the 340 cipher, mailed in November 1969. This second cipher contained 340 symbols and proved to be an unbreakable code for half a century. It was so complex that it resisted the combined efforts of the FBI, the NSA, and countless amateur and professional cryptographers. For decades, the 340 cipher represented the Zodiac's impenetrable veil. The quirky or fringe tidbit associated with this is the almost mythical status of the cipher itself, which was finally solved in 2020 by a team of civilian codebreakers using specialized software. The decoded message was another boastful, rambling rant beginning, "I hope you're having lots of fun in trying to catch me," and ending with a strange reference to a movie. Again, it revealed no direct name. The long delay in cracking the code was less about Zodiac's genius, and more about the unusual diagonally moving encryption pattern he used. The case of the Zodiac Killer is one defined by paradox, a killer who desperately wanted credit, but never revealed his true identity. Historians still argue whether the Zodiac Killer committed only the 5 confirmed murders, or if his tally extends to 20 or even 37 victims, as he claimed in his letters. The confirmed cases are linked by ballistic and fingerprint evidence, but the Zodiac's theatrical claims made it difficult to separate fact from psychological manipulation. He often took credit for unsolved crimes that police could not link back to him, muddying the waters and terrorizing the entire region. You examine the infamous hand-drawn Zodiac symbol, a circle with a cross superimposed on it, the same symbol used to mark targets on his letters. It suggests an obsession with astrology, or perhaps a kind of self-styled anti-religious philosophy. His letters were filled with misspellings, sometimes deliberate and strange, menacing demands. He threatened to bomb school buses and even use a unique bomb he claimed to have invented, which he called a death machine. The investigation suffered from the sheer volume of misinformation and the killer's manipulative tactics. The police identified a number of key suspects over the years, most notably Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester from Vallejo. Allen fit many of the vague eyewitness descriptions, lived in the right areas, and had a watch with the zodiac crosshairs engraved on it. Yet, the physical evidence, specifically fingerprints and handwriting, never conclusively matched him, though the debate over whether he was the true killer continues to rage, even after his death in 1992. The lasting mystery of the Zodiac Killer is not just who he was, but why he stopped. After 1974, the letters and phone calls ceased. Did he die? Was he incarcerated for another crime? Or did he simply move, retiring the persona because the thrill of the chase had worn off? The silence after 1974 is almost as chilling as the initial terror, leaving a community wondering if their ghost was still among them, watching. You stand in the shadows of the foggy city, a witness to a killer who successfully weaponized the media and the public's fear. The Zodiac remains a perfect symbol of an unsolved mystery in the age of communication. A man who told the world exactly what he was doing, wrote pages upon pages of taunts, and yet still managed to keep the most vital secret, his name, buried within the static of his own twisted legend. You are now stepping away from the grim realities of the 20th century serial killer and into the realm of classical antiquity and enduring legend. You're standing in the sun-drenched halls of ancient Athens, 2,400 years ago, listening to a conversation between the philosopher Plato and his audience. This is where the story of Atlantis, the most famous lost city in history, begins. The mystery here is less about a physical location and more about the nature of truth and the power of myth. Plato introduced the concept of Atlantis in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE. He claimed the story came to him through a lineage of oral tradition, tracing back to the Athenian statesman Solon, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests. This is the mainstream historical fact that anchors the entire enigma. Atlantis is a creation of Plato, and his texts are the only definitive, original source for the story. You listen as Plato describes a vast utopian island nation, a naval power located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. He paints a picture of a magnificent, technologically advanced civilization, far superior to ancient Greece. He describes their capital city as concentric rings of land and water, connected by canals, with impressive harbours, advanced machinery, and abundant resources. They were a just and noble people, until their greed and power corrupted them. The Atlanteans, in a fit of imperialistic ambition, attempted to conquer the Mediterranean world, including Athens. The story culminates in a dramatic cataclysm. According to Plato, the gods, angered by the Atlanteans' hubris and moral decay, sent a terrible series of earthquakes and floods that caused Atlantis to sink in a single day and night of misfortune and vanish beneath the waves. The central and most persistent question is, was Plato recounting a genuine historical event that happened 9,000 years before his time, as he claimed, or was he using the story as a political and moral allegory? Most classical scholars firmly believe the latter. They argue that Plato created Atlantis as a literary foil, a cautionary tale of a wealthy, militarily aggressive society destroyed by its own internal corruption and arrogance, to contrast with his idealized, simpler Athens. However, the sheer precision of Plato's details has led to centuries of literal determined searches. You feel the pull of the literalist theory, the romantic notion that such a magnificent city could genuinely be out there, preserved beneath the ocean. This search for a physical Atlantis is where the quirky or fringe tidbit shines. Over the decades, dozens of locations have been proposed as the real Atlantis, based on tenuous readings of Plato's clues, or sometimes purely on coincidence. You might be standing in the Bahamas, examining a large underwater rock formation called the Bimini Road, which some insist is a submerged man-made wall or road. Or perhaps you're in the Mediterranean, looking at the volcanic island of Santorini, ancient Thera, whose Minoan civilization was indeed devastated by a massive volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE. The Santorini theory is historically grounded, involving a real civilization and a genuine cataclysm. But it happened thousands of years after Plato's claimed date, and the size and location don't match his descriptions. You may even hear whispers of a site in the Eye of the Sahara in Mauritania, the Risha structure, a vast concentric geological formation that geometrically matches Plato's description of the city, though it is inland and terrestrial. Historians still argue whether the enduring popularity of Atlantis stems from a need for a golden age myth, or if Plato deliberately embedded elements of real-world history into his allegory. The truth may lie somewhere in between. It is highly plausible that Plato drew inspiration from real historical events, perhaps the destruction of Thera, or the flooding of coastal settlements during earlier periods of geological instability in the Mediterranean. These kernels of reality would have lent credibility and weight to his allegorical message, making the story feel more grounded and powerful to his audience. The desire to find Atlantis is, at its core, a human desire to find evidence of a grand, lost past. If a highly advanced civilization could simply be wiped out and erased in a day, it serves as a powerful psychological reminder of the fragility of our own achievements. Ultimately, the mystery of Atlantis is unique in our collection, because it is a self-sustaining enigma. It is a mystery that only exists because one of the greatest minds in history wrote it down. You are watching a fictional city leap off the page and take on a life of its own in the collective human imagination, spawning countless books, expeditions and theories. You walk away from the marble halls of Athens, understanding that Atlantis is likely not a sunken city to be discovered, but a powerful ancient metaphor for the rise and catastrophic fall of civilization, a warning delivered by Plato that continues to ripple through time. You're now making a vast geographical leap, leaving the ancient sunken cities for a quiet, high-desert town in New Mexico. The year is contemporary, and the air is dry, thin, and remarkably still. You're standing in Taos, a beautiful, artistic community nestled beneath the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a place where people come seeking quiet and tranquility. But for a select, unfortunate few of its residents, the quiet is constantly and maddeningly broken by an insidious, pervasive sound known as the Taos hum. You strain your ears, trying to detect it. The hum is generally described as a low-frequency, persistent and intrusive droning or rumbling sound, akin to a distant diesel engine idling or a refrigerator running perpetually. The key mainstream historical fact is that only a tiny fraction of the population, estimated at about 2%, can actually hear the sound. The vast majority of people, including most visitors and many researchers, hear nothing at all. For those who do hear it, the noise ranges from a mild annoyance to a psychologically tormenting presence that interferes with sleep, concentration, and quality of life. You talk to a resident who is a hummer. They describe the sound not just as audible, but often as a vibration felt in the body, particularly in the teeth or skull. They report that the sound is often louder indoors, particularly at night, and that certain materials or locations, such as a concrete basement or a car, seem to amplify it. Imagine trying to sleep when your entire environment feels like it's vibrating at the frequency of a low, continuous C note. This auditory/somatic distortion makes the Taos hum a unique and particularly frustrating phenomenon for both sufferers and scientists. The problem, and the core of the mystery, is that despite decades of investigation, scientists have been unable to find a consistent external source for the sound that matches what the hearers report. The University of New Mexico and other researchers have used highly sensitive microphones and electromagnetic sensors to try and pinpoint the source. While they detect the standard background noise, traffic, distant industrial activity, atmospheric noise, they have found no single persistent physical signature that corresponds to the hum described by the residents. This lack of an external, measurable physical source is what elevates the Taos hum to a genuine unsolved mystery. This leads to the crucial question: is the sound environmental or physiological? Historians still argue whether the Taos hum is a real, measurable, geophysical phenomenon or a form of subjective internal auditory perception. The environmental theory attempts to locate a real, non-local source. You're standing in the high desert, and there are many possibilities for distant noise. Could it be distant industrial machinery, Perhaps some form of high-powered pumping or ventilation system miles away? Could it be low-frequency seismic activity, a kind of constant low-level rumble from the Earth itself? One of the more interesting, slightly quirky or fringe tidbits in the environmental camp is the theory of very low-frequency VLF, or extremely low-frequency ELF radio waves. These are used by militaries for submarine communication or by various remote scientific installations. Theoretically, these waves, particularly at certain frequencies, could interact with the landscape or even structures in such a way as to be converted into audible sound waves for certain sensitive individuals. The fact that the sound is reported across different continents, similar hums, have been reported in Bristol, UK and Kokomo, Indiana, suggests a potential non-local, widely dispersed cause. Then there is the physiological theory. Given that only a small percentage of people can hear it, the hypothesis suggests that the hum may not be a true sound, but a form of tinnitus, a condition where a person hears sound when no external sound is present. Specifically, it might be a rare, low-frequency form of objective tinnitus, where the sound is actually generated within the person's own body, perhaps by blood flow or muscle spasm, and sometimes detectable by a doctor. Or subjective tinnitus, where the sound is only perceived by the individual. The argument against this, strongly voiced by the sufferers, is the consistency of the sound and its seeming reaction to external conditions. They claim the hum changes intensity and character, suggesting it is reacting to something real outside the body, not a constant internal malfunction. The research done in Taos concluded that the hummers were not hallucinating, nor were they mass hysterics. They were, in fact, different from the general population. Testing revealed that the hummers often displayed unusual sensitivity in the 30 to 80 Hz range, the exact low-frequency range where the hum is usually reported. This suggests a physical reality to their hearing that is simply hyperacute, allowing them to pick up low-level ambient noise that the rest of us filter out. You leave the quiet town of Taos, the silence feeling somehow heavy and charged. The Taos hum is a mystery that forces you to confront the limits of scientific measurement and human perception. Is there an invisible, unheard rumble coursing through the Earth, a natural or man-made drone that only a few hypersensitive individuals can detect? Or is it a collective psychological phenomenon, a unique form of low-frequency tinnitus that has been localized to a single community by the power of suggestion and shared experience? Whichever answer you lean toward, you're left with the chilling thought that what you perceive as silence might, for someone else, be a perpetual, low-frequency scream. You're now moving from the elusive modern drone of the Taos hum to the silent, staggering ancient geometry of Giza. The air here is hot and dry, carrying the scent of millennia-old limestone dust. You're standing at the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops, the largest and oldest of the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. This isn't a mystery of something lost, but of something so massively present, so precisely engineered, that its construction and hidden purpose remain profoundly baffling. You look up at the sheer scale of the structure. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. This is the mainstream historical fact that humbles all visitors. The pyramid is composed of approximately 2.3 million limestone and granite blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. The total weight is estimated at 5.75 million tons. You place your hand on one of the enormous base blocks and feel the weight of unimaginable human effort and precision engineering. The construction is generally dated to around 2560 BCE, during the 4th dynasty, as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu. The first profound mystery is one of logistics and labour. How did the ancient Egyptians move these colossal stones from quarries, some local, others, like the granite for the inner chambers, from Aswan, over 500 miles away, and then lift them to a height of nearly 140 metres? While theories abound, the lack of definitive engineering documentation leaves an enormous gap. You'll hear whispers of massive straight ramps, or perhaps spiralling ramps built around the outside, or even internal ramps. Historians still argue whether the blocks were hauled up massive external ramps using muscle, ropes, and a system of water-lubricated sledges, or whether they employed a long-lost system of sophisticated internal mechanisms. The sheer speed required to place a block every 2 to 3 minutes, 24 hours a day for 20 years is mind-boggling, even with a massive organised workforce. You duck your head and enter the pyramid through the rough-hewn robber's tunnel, eventually emerging into the smooth, precise architecture of the interior. You're not just struck by the exterior size, but the internal precision. The passages are aligned with astonishing accuracy. The perimeter of the base is nearly a perfect square, with only a tiny fraction of an inch of error, and the sides are aligned almost perfectly with the 4 cardinal directions. This astronomical precision, achieved without modern surveying equipment, suggests a level of mathematical and observational skill that we're only beginning to appreciate. You climb the steep, impressive Grand Gallery, a marvel of corbelled masonry leading up to the King's Chamber. Here, you confront the granite sarcophagus, empty, lidless, and too large to have been moved into the chamber after the construction was complete, meaning it had to be installed while the chamber was still being built. This chamber, and the 2 above it, the Queen's Chamber and the unfinished subterranean chamber, hold the key to the next deepest layer of the mystery, the hidden voids and shafts. The King's and Queen's chambers each contain 2 small narrow shafts, traditionally called air shafts, that angle up toward the outside. In the King's Chamber, these shafts break through to the exterior. However, in the Queen's Chamber, they terminate before reaching the outside and were sealed by small, tantalizingly complex stone doors. This is a crucial quirky or fringe tidbit. The door with the copper handles discovered in 1993 by the robot Upuat 2 in the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. This robot later drilled through the door only to find a second, identical door just 20 centimetres behind it. What is behind that second door? And what was the original purpose of these shafts? Were they for ventilation, or were they ritualistic conduits for the pharaoh's soul, the Bear and Ka, to ascend to the stars, specifically to the constellation of Orion, believed to be associated with the god Osiris? More recently, the Scan Pyramids project has utilised non-invasive technology like muon tomography. Think of it as X-raying the pyramid using cosmic rays to map the internal structure. In 2017, this project announced a massive, previously unknown void or cavity above the Grand Gallery, an empty space at least 30 metres long. You feel the cold thrill of an entirely new, unbreached chamber. Was this void an undiscovered burial chamber? Was it merely an architectural necessity, a relieving chamber to distribute the massive weight of the stone above the Grand Gallery to prevent collapse? Or does it hide something else? No one knows yet, and the debate over the void's nature and contents is fiercely ongoing. This leads to the persistent romantic idea that the Great Pyramid is more than a tomb. Some fringe historians suggest that its precise geometry, its location at the geographical centre of the Earth's landmasses, and its alignment to true north and specific stars indicate a function as a massive, world-spanning, energy-producing device, a concept that quickly strays into speculative territory. While there is no archaeological evidence to support these ideas, the sheer complexity of the structure, and the absence of Khufu's actual mummy or definitive funerary goods within the main chambers, fuels the belief that the true purpose of the pyramid has yet to be revealed. You walk out into the harsh sunlight, looking back at the pyramid. It is a monument to an extreme level of organisation, belief, and engineering skill that we still struggle to fully comprehend. The enduring mystery lies in that immense gap, a civilization capable of such flawless, monolithic construction, yet one that left behind no instruction manuals for its most extraordinary creation. The Great Pyramid is a silent, 4,500-year-old challenge, daring us to figure out its secrets. You're stepping out of the shadows of the monumental Great Pyramid and into a quiet, climate-controlled corner of a museum in Baghdad. Or perhaps you're imagining yourself in the basement of a German archaeologist's collection. The year is 1938, and the artefact you're examining is an unassuming 14-centimetre tall clay jar found during an excavation near Kujut Rabu, a village south of Baghdad, in a site dating back to the Parthian era, roughly between 250 BCE and 224 CE. This is the object that would come to be known as the Baghdad Battery, and it immediately challenges the timeline of technological history. You hold the jar in your hands. It is not an impressive sight, just sun-dried yellowish clay. Inside, however, is what makes it baffling. The jar contains a cylinder made of pure copper, and inside the copper cylinder is an iron rod. The copper cylinder is sealed at the bottom with bitumen, asphalt, and the top of the iron rod is separated from the copper by another bitumen plug. This is a very specific, carefully constructed assembly. This core structure, two dissimilar metals separated by an electrolyte, is the fundamental design of a basic electrochemical cell, or as we call it today, a battery. The key mainstream historical fact here is the dating. If this object was indeed used to generate an electrical current, it would predate the generally accepted invention of the battery by over 1,800 years. The first documented electrical cell was created by Alessandro Volta in 1800 CE. The idea that Parthian artisans in ancient Mesopotamia had a grasp of basic chemistry and electricity is so radical that it forces a complete re-evaluation of classical technology. But was it a battery? The biggest piece of missing evidence is the electrolyte. To work, the jar would need to have been filled with an acidic or alkaline liquid. Scientists testing replicas of the artifact have found that filling the jar with substances available to the Parthians, grape juice, lemon juice, or vinegar, can produce a small electrical charge, generating about 0.8 to 2.0 volts of electricity. This voltage is too low to power anything substantial, but it is enough for a number of highly specialized low-current applications. This leads to the question of use. If they had this technology, what were they doing with it? The most popular and compelling theory, and the quirky or fringe tidbit that often grabs attention, is electroplating, or gold plating. You can imagine a jeweller in ancient Ctesiphon using a series of these jars, wired together in a sequence, to create a low-voltage bath. This technique, called electrotyping, could deposit a thin, even layer of gold onto a base metal object. While traditional mercury gilding was the common method, it was highly toxic and often resulted in a messy, uneven finish. The ability to use electricity to apply gold or silver smoothly would have been a prized hidden trade secret. Archaeologists have found evidence of finely plated metal objects in the region that are so uniformly covered that some speculate they could only have been created through an electrochemical process. However, this is a theory of circumstance, not proof. No definitive electroplating workshop containing multiple wired Baghdad batteries has ever been found. This lack of definitive evidence forces the debate. Historians still argue whether the Baghdad battery was a true electrical device or a container for ritualistic documents or medicinal scrolls. The alternative, non-electrical theories suggest the jar was used simply as a storage vessel. Some scholars propose it was a container for the highly corrosive scrolls or papyri that needed protection from moisture, or perhaps a vessel for storing spices or other volatile substances. The presence of the iron rod and copper cylinder could be purely accidental, or simply a means of holding a scroll in place, with the iron rod acting as a support. Another non-electrical theory suggests a medical use. The Greeks and other ancient peoples were aware that certain electric fish, like the torpedo ray, could generate shocks that were used to numb pain during surgery or treat gout. Could the Baghdad battery have been used as a very mild form of electrotherapy, perhaps by being placed on the body to alleviate minor pain? The low voltage would likely only create a mild tingling, but in the realm of ancient medicine, a mysterious tingling sensation might be interpreted as a powerful healing force. You look closely at the corroded iron rod. The corrosion suggests that the metal was exposed to an acidic agent, which lends credence to the battery theory. Grape juice or vinegar would certainly do that. If it were merely a scroll holder, why the careful assembly of two specific reactive metals? The mystery of the Baghdad battery is a perfect example of how one artifact can challenge our neat linear view of history. If the Parthians were indeed capable of generating electricity, it suggests a lost chapter of ancient science that was either forgotten or suppressed, not to be rediscovered for nearly 2 millennia. You can almost hear the quiet hum of a secret technology, a tiny spark of electrical knowledge tucked away in the ancient world, now stubbornly refusing to be dismissed as mere happenstance. You are leaving the dry, ancient enigma of the Baghdad battery and descending into the cold, crushing blackness of the deep South Pacific Ocean. You are on board a highly sensitive hydrophone array, part of the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's NOAA equipment, listening to the deepest parts of the planet. The time is 1997. This is not a search for a lost artifact or a vanished ship. This is an attempt to identify a sound, a noise so powerful and strange that it has been permanently catalogued as an acoustic mystery. The bloop. The key mainstream historical fact is the sound itself, which was recorded multiple times by the Equator Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array. This array, originally developed to monitor secret Soviet submarine activity, is incredibly precise. The sound was an ultra-low frequency, high-amplitude underwater acoustic event. It lasted for about a minute and was powerful enough to be picked up by sensors over 5,000 kilometers, 3,000 miles, apart. You hear the deep, rising and falling sound, a sequence of massive low-frequency pressure waves, which, when sped up to make it audible to the human ear, resembles a gargantuan bloop. The sheer distance over which the sound was recorded is what makes it so extraordinary. To travel 5,000 kilometers through the water at that frequency, the sound source had to be orders of magnitude louder than any known biological noise. You feel the deep bass rumble vibrate through your core, a sound too large to be anything familiar. The search immediately focused on potential origins. Could it be man-made? The time of the recording and the nature of the sound quickly ruled out submarines, bombs, or ships. The sound was clearly not mechanical or explosive. Could it be a geophysical event? Submarine volcanoes or massive underwater earthquakes can generate such powerful, low-frequency noise. However, the hydrothermal venting and earthquake sounds recorded by the array have distinct characteristics, sharp, chaotic, and often sustained, that did not match the bloop's unique signature, which was rapid, varying in frequency, and lasted for an unusually long duration. The primary focus of the scientific investigation shifted to a biological source. This is where the mystery truly congeals. The characteristics of the bloop, the changing frequency and amplitude over its minute long duration, suggested it was the sound of a living creature. But what creature could possibly be capable of producing a sound so loud, so far-reaching, and so low in frequency? This is the ultimate chilling, quirky, or fringe tidbit of the bloop. To be heard 5,000 kilometers away, the creature would have to be significantly larger than a blue whale, the loudest animal known to man. You stand there, peering into the crushing blackness of the abyss, contemplating the possibility of a colossal, unknown marine animal. Scientists acknowledge that only a tiny fraction of the deep ocean has been explored. Could there be a species of whale or an undiscovered giant cephalopod that inhabits the deep ocean trenches? A creature evolved to communicate across vast ocean basins using acoustic power that dwarfs anything we know? The idea of a creature of truly titanic size, completely unknown to science, silently roaming the abyssal zone, is profoundly unsettling. It challenges the confidence we have in our knowledge of our own planet's dominant life forms. Historians still argue whether the bloop was a highly unusual seismic icequake, or the sound of a massive undiscovered life form. The icequake theory has gained considerable traction in the years since the initial discovery. Icequakes are seismic events caused by the fracturing of enormous ice sheets, usually in the Arctic or Antarctic, as they carve and move. The unique waveform of the bloop, the rapid change in frequency, is highly consistent with the characteristics of large ice fracturing events. The key to this theory is the likely source location. Triangulation of the bloop's original signal placed its origin roughly around 50 degrees south and 100 degrees west in the Pacific. While far from Antarctica, the sound could have travelled along the Deep Sound Channel, also FAR channel, a layer in the ocean where sound waves can travel vast distances with minimal attenuation, from a source near the Antarctic coast. In fact, NOAA scientists have, in later years, recorded similar, albeit less dramatic, sounds consistent with icequakes that correlate well with the bloop's unique signature. However, the question remains, why did the bloop have such a unique, almost biological-sounding cadence? The speed and intensity still make it an outlier. The mystery persists because the scientific community, while largely leaning toward the icequake theory, has never been able to produce a definitive, confirmed source recording of a gargantuan ice fracture that perfectly matches the characteristics of the 1997 bloop. It remains, officially, of unknown origin. You step away from the hydrophone array, the faint memory of that colossal low rumble still echoing in your mind. The bloop is more than just a sound. It's a testament to the fact that the ocean still holds secrets, either a colossal geological secret or, more thrillingly, a colossal biological one. You can't help but think of the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, who famously placed his monstrous Cthulhu in the deep South Pacific, in the exact region where the bloop was recorded. The fact that the most advanced underwater listening device in the world detected a sound that could only be explained by a creature far larger than anything we've classified, or a force of nature we don't fully track, is a humbling thought as you emerge from the cold darkness. You are leaving the unsettling deep-sea sounds and travelling back in time, landing on the sun-drenched rocky island of Crete, specifically the Minoan ruins of Phaistos. The year is 1908. The artefact you're about to examine is small, circular, and unlike anything else discovered in the archaeological record, the Phaistos disc. This humble object, found by Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier, is a 15-centimetre diameter disc of fired clay, covered on both sides with a mesmerising spiral of stamped hieroglyphic symbols. The date of the disc is a crucial mainstream historical fact. It's reliably dated to the Middle or Late Minoan Bronze Age, around 1700 BCE. This makes it contemporary with the height of Minoan civilization, a culture that produced complex, still undeciphered scripts, like Linear A. Yet, the Phaistos disc is not written in Linear A. It is covered with 241 impressions, made up of 45 distinct symbols, stamped into the clay while it was still wet. You run your fingers over the smooth, baked clay, tracing the spiral path of the symbols. This method of creation, stamping symbols with individual pre-made seals, is itself a profound part of the mystery. It suggests a form of early movable type, predating Johannes Gutenberg's printing press by over 3,000 years. This is a crucial quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores the advanced, yet utterly singular, nature of this artefact. If the Minoans had the technology of movable type, why have no other examples, no other discs, and no other stamping tools ever been found? This uniqueness suggests two possibilities. Either the disc is a singular experiment that was never replicated, or the disc was imported from another culture whose system of writing used similar stamping tools, a possibility that is historically difficult to confirm. The symbols themselves are tantalizingly pictorial. You can clearly identify 45 different stamps, depicting human figures, a man's head, a man walking, animals, birds, a cat's head, tools, a carpenter's square, a comb, plants, and architectural features. This suggests a syllabic or logographic script, where each symbol represents a syllable or a whole word idea. The arrangement, divided into sections by vertical lines, suggests a language flowing either clockwise or counterclockwise from the edge to the centre. Now comes the central, frustrating question. What does it say? No one has definitively deciphered the Phaistos disc. Historians still argue whether the disc contains a religious hymn, a treaty, a sales receipt, or perhaps a prayer. The attempts at translation are legion, often based on two fundamentally different assumptions about the underlying language. One major theory posits that the language is Minoan, related to Linear A, but using a unique, formalised script. Attempts to assign values from Linear A to the disc as symbols have been inconclusive, resulting in translations that are often nonsensical or overly specialised. For example, some translations claim it is a prayer to the Earth Mother goddess, while others claim it's a list of military officers. The problem is that without a Rosetta Stone, a bilingual text where the same message is written in both the known language and the unknown script, decipherment is an exercise in educated guessing and often wishful thinking. The second major theory is that the disc is an import. Some scholars suggest the script is related to languages from Anatolia, modern Turkey, or the Lycian language. The symbols for a ship, a feathered head, or a type of flower have been tenuously linked to iconography found in regions outside of Crete. If it is an import, it explains the singular nature of the artefact in the Cretan context, but it simply shifts the geographical location of the undeciphered language, not the difficulty of solving the puzzle. A few bold, though highly contested, interpretations propose a complete break from traditional linguistic approaches. One, for instance, suggests the disc is a complex early calendar or an astronomical chart, with the symbols representing constellations or specific astronomical events. Another suggests it's a board game, with the symbols indicating moves or rules. The lack of any accompanying material, no other clay tablets or inscriptions using this script have ever been found, is the biggest hurdle. A successful decipherment of any ancient script requires a corpus of texts large enough to establish reliable frequency analysis and context. With the Phaistos disc, we have a sample size of 1. It is a single, beautiful message sent across 3,700 years, perfectly preserved, yet mute. You leave the quiet museum, the image of that spiral clay disc burned into your mind. The Phaistos disc is a poignant reminder of the fragility of communication, a complex, ingenious method of writing created, perhaps used for a short time, and then lost, leaving a solitary, beautiful, and eternally silent message that teases us with the hidden intellectual life of the Minoan civilization. It's the ultimate linguistic lock with no key, and the quiet thrill of knowing that an entire narrative is contained within that small circle is enough to keep cryptographers and archaeologists captivated for another century. You're now being pulled away from the ancient dusty ruins of Crete and thrust into the perpetual chilling fog of Victorian London. The year is 1888, and the district is Whitechapel, a notorious labyrinth of overcrowded, desperately poor streets and dark alleys in the East End. The atmosphere is thick with the smell of coal smoke, gin, and dread. You're walking the beat where the most infamous and still unidentified serial killer in history stalked his victims, Jack the Ripper. The Ripper's known killing spree was terrifyingly brief, concentrated mainly between August and November of that year, a period known as the Autumn of Terror. The key mainstream historical fact is the identity of the canonical 5 victims: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, all impoverished women working as prostitutes in the area. The murders were brutal, characterised by deep, precise throat cuttings and severe, targeted abdominal mutilations. The clinical, almost surgical nature of the injuries suggested to police that the killer possessed some anatomical knowledge, perhaps as a doctor, a butcher, or a surgical student. You stand in the shadows of a lodging house, imagining the fear that gripped the city. The terror was compounded not just by the violence, but by the killer's audacious communications. The name Jack the Ripper originated not from the police, but from a letter sent to the Central News Agency, signed with that chilling moniker. The police considered it, and many other letters, to be hoaxes written by attention seekers. However, one letter, the From Hell letter, was particularly unsettling. It was sent to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and it arrived with a small box containing half of a preserved human kidney, allegedly taken from victim Catherine Eddowes, with the killer promising to send the other half. The accompanying note was chillingly taunting. This is where the mystery of the Ripper transcends a typical police investigation. It's not just a murder case. It's a case of a hidden identity that became a pervasive myth, largely fueled by the dramatic flair of the letters, whether real or fake. Historians still argue whether the killer wrote any of the letters, or if the press and opportunistic hoaxers created the persona of Jack the Ripper entirely, to the point that the killer adopted the name himself. Most scholars today believe only the From Hell letter, due to the kidney fragment, has a high probability of authenticity, but even that is fiercely debated. The investigation was a chaotic mess, reflecting the limitations of 19th century forensics and policing. There was no fingerprinting, no DNA evidence. The police relied entirely on flawed eyewitness accounts, which were often contradictory, and limited blood analysis. The only piece of physical evidence that seemed truly promising was a piece of apron fabric found near one scene, which contained blood and what appeared to be human feces. But even this evidence was soon lost, adding another layer of frustrating incompetence to the case. The identity of the Ripper has become the source of an obsession known as Ripperology, spawning hundreds of books and thousands of suspects. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit of this story. The staggering list of viable, often highly eccentric suspects, each championed by various investigators and authors over the past century. You might hear a detective argue for Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the grandson of Queen Victoria, suggesting a sensational royal cover-up driven by madness or an illegitimate child. You'd likely hear the name Walter Sickert, a famous post-impressionist painter who was obsessed with the case, his art sometimes depicting the sordid lives of the East End. Or perhaps Montague John Druitt, a barrister who was secretly a homosexual and mysteriously died soon after the murders ended, making him a convenient suspect for the police at the time. The most recent compelling theories often focus on suspects with known medical backgrounds, which would explain the mutilations. One prominent theory, popularised in recent years, centres on a Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski, who worked as a barber and was institutionalised shortly after the last canonical murder. His name came from a note made by a high-ranking police official at the time. This theory was given a modern forensic boost by a private investigator who claimed to have used mitochondrial DNA from a shawl allegedly found at a crime scene to match Kosminski. However, this DNA evidence is intensely controversial due to issues of contamination and the complex nature of mitochondrial DNA. The enduring secret of Jack the Ripper lies in his ability to perfectly exploit the gap between Victorian social misery and the nascent field of forensic science. He was a product of the gaslit alleyways, a shadow who used the lack of communication and coordination between various police bodies, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, to his advantage. The mystery is less about catching him, and more about the failure of the system to contain him. You leave the dark, narrow streets of Whitechapel, the sound of the era's fearful whispers still in your ears. The Ripper's case remains open, not because the police were lazy, but because in 1888, a killer who confined his murders to the shadows and used the emerging culture of celebrity violence was perfectly positioned to slip through the fingers of law enforcement, leaving behind only a chilling name and a legacy of permanent, unnerving anonymity. You are leaving the gaslit horror of Victorian London for the sun-blasted, unforgiving heat of the California desert. The place is Death Valley National Park, and the specific location is Racetrack Playa, a perfectly flat dry lake bed, or playa, nestled between the Cottonwood and Last Chance mountain ranges. The mystery here is less about human agency or ancient scripts, and more about the strange, slow, quiet defiance of basic physics. You're standing on a vast, cracked mud surface, a scene of profound silence and desolation. The key mainstream historical fact is the existence of the sailing stones, also called moving rocks. These are geological features, stones ranging in size from pebbles to rocks weighing as much as 700 pounds, that somehow move across the exceptionally smooth surface of the playa, leaving long distinct tracks, or race tracks, carved into the mud behind them. You walk along the tracks, some of which stretch for hundreds of feet, sometimes curving sharply, sometimes running in parallel, and sometimes abruptly changing direction. For decades, the movement of these stones was a complete enigma, especially since no one had ever actually witnessed the stones moving. The visual evidence was indisputable. The tracks were there, and the stones were at the end of them, but the process remained invisible and stubbornly silent. It became the ultimate quirky or fringe tidbit, a kind of geological ghost story, with objects moving themselves, seemingly in defiance of the laws of motion. You look at a stone, perhaps the size of a dinner plate sitting at the end of a long trail. You ponder the early theories, many of which lean toward the dramatic. Was it a strong magnetic field pulling the iron-containing rocks? Was it extreme winds? High-powered winds measured at over 50 miles per hour were certainly possible in the valley, but calculations showed that even hurricane-force winds would not be strong enough to overcome the friction of the large stones on the mud surface. You might hear whispers of supernatural forces, vortexes, or even the subtle presence of an alien technology. A testament to how completely baffling the phenomenon was without observation. The resolution to this century-long mystery is a perfect example of how persistence and modern technology can eventually unravel even the most stubborn natural puzzle. This is where the narrative shifts from mystery to revelation, even though the sheer timing and combination of necessary conditions remain unpredictable and rare. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Dr. Richard Norris and his cousin James Norris decided to use GPS tracking and time-lapse photography. They received permission to place GPS units inside 15 specifically selected stones without altering their shape or weight. The initial setup was frustrating. For the first year, nothing happened. The stones sat motionless, just as they had for all of human history. Then, on a surprisingly cold day in December 2013, and continuing into January 2014, the conditions necessary for the movement finally aligned, and the team captured the movement on camera. You watch the time-lapse footage, seeing a scene that had never been documented before. The movement requires a highly specific set of extremely rare environmental conditions, and the absence of any one of them would prevent the movement. 1. A layer of water the player must fill with enough rain to form a shallow pond only a few inches deep. 2. Nighttime temperatures. The temperature must drop low enough, usually overnight, to form a thin layer of ice on the surface of the pond, but the ice must not be thick enough to freeze the water all the way through to the bottom. 3. Sunlight and melting. The ice must begin to break up into large floating ice panels under the heat of the morning sun. 4. Light wind. Crucially, a light breeze, Often less than 10 miles per hour is needed to push the ice panels. When all these factors align, the ice panels act as a massive sail. The ice sheets, often meters wide, push against the stationary stones. The water beneath the ice layer acts as a lubricant, reducing the friction between the stone and the soft mud surface to a bare minimum. The stones don't float. They are subtly pushed by the massive force of the moving ice sheets. The tracks are created in the soft mud beneath the ice, as the stones are slowly shoved along at a snail's pace, just 2 to 6 inches per second. The researchers were able to capture movement events where dozens of stones moved simultaneously, and the tracks clearly showed the paths dictated by the shifting, fracturing ice sheets. The sharp turns and erratic paths were simply the stones moving with the ever-changing direction of the ice panels. So, while the how has been largely resolved, a deeper, more subtle mystery remains. Historians still argue whether the movement of the stones is purely a matter of physics, or if the sheer, rare timing of the event remains a near miracle of natural synchronicity. The precise cocktail of cold, water, and specific wind conditions happens so infrequently, perhaps once a decade or less, that the mystery persists in the collective imagination, a reminder that the world holds wonders we simply haven't been patient enough to observe. The sailing stones are a monument to the extraordinary power of subtle forces, and they serve as the final, quiet curtain call on our journey into the unexplained. You stand on the playa, feeling the dry heat, and realise that the greatest mystery was simply the speed of time itself. The stones moved, but only when we weren't looking, for the briefest, most perfect windows of environmental opportunity. It's time now to let the dry desert air of Death Valley wash away the tensions of the long night. The shadows are softening, and the complex knots of these 15 ancient and modern enigmas are easing their grip on your thoughts. You have journeyed through 400 years of unexplained colonial silence at Roanoke, heard the phantom flight of D.B. Cooper over the Pacific Northwest, and felt the chilling, invisible dread that emptied a tent on Dyatlov Pass. You've listened to the earth hum its secrets, felt the crushing silence of the Mary Celeste, and pondered the hidden engineering of the pyramids. Now, as the last images of the sailing stones, pushed by their ghost-like sheets of ice, fade from your mind's eye, allow your own internal currents to slow. The unanswered questions are not meant to frighten you. They are simply reminders that the world is larger, more complex and more mysterious than the neat boundaries we build around it. There is always more to learn, more to discover, and more wonder to be found in the things we cannot yet fully explain. Let the lingering awe of these histories be the last thought you hold, a soft, comfortable weight that pulls you gently down, down, down into rest.